What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the May 9th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a weird MLB day today, 2-3 game slates. So on the one hand, it's nice because, like we were saying yesterday, you get two chances to win. If the first slate doesn't go well, you get to run it back. But do wish there were a few more games. But 3-game slates can be pretty fun. There's more strategy to it than usual, I think, especially if you're playing tournaments or large field tournaments specifically. So we can get into that during the show, in addition to just talking through what the best plays are. As always, if you have questions, throw them in chat. Happy to talk about them, whether it is strategy or slate specific, whatever it may be. Hit the thumbs up button, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. All of that helps out quite a bit. You guys have been awesome about that so far. So we're going to jump right into it, starting with the Seattle Mariners taking on the Minnesota Twins, starting obviously with the early slate at 1:10 Eastern. Seattle taking on the Twins. This game only has a 7-run total. Not likely to have a lot of offense in this game, as you have two very good pitchers facing off against each other. Pablo Lopez going for the Twins, Logan Gilbert on the mound for Seattle. We know that the Mariners strike out a ton. They lead baseball so far this season in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They struck out a bunch against Chris Paddock last night. They struck out a bunch against every other pitcher they faced in every other game this year, it seems like. And the line on Pablo Lopez, last I checked, was 8.5 strikeouts, -170 on DraftKings was the best price. So really high strikeout prop for Lopez. I bet the under there, but like 8.5 is such a high line. So Lopez clearly looks really good. He's projected for 68% ownership. He showed up in 55% of the lineups that I built. So clearly, I think he's a great play. He was in over half the lineups that I built. He's very, very likely to be an optimal pitcher. The problem is the ownership itself. 68% is such a high number just as far as trying to be different, but he does look really, really good here. Good strikeout pitcher himself. It's not even like yesterday where you're talking about Chris Paddock, who isn't a great strikeout pitcher on his own and needs that help from Seattle. Pablo Lopez has the highest strikeout percentage on this slate, striking out 30.2% of hitters, 2.9 xFIP so far this season. Really, really good pitcher. Really good strikeout matchup. There's not really anything negative to say other than figure out how to be different around his ownership. Logan Gilbert also getting a lot of ownership, pulling 41%. He's $10,000 on DraftKings, so he's actually $700 more expensive than Lopez is, which isn't right, but he's still a really, really good play. We've seen Gilbert's strikeout percentage climb this season as well. He's up to 28.2%, 3.32 xFIP. And his stuff's graded out better as well. You can see here, looking at the pitcher table that I like to look at, his strikeout percentage is up 4 points from last year. And we're far enough into the season where you can typically start to buy into stuff like that, assuming that the pitcher has made all of his starts, which has been the case for Gilbert. On top of that, you can go and look at other underlying numbers. And you can see here his fastball velocity is the same, so that's not changing anything. But what really stands out is the Stuff Plus grade for him, 103.9 since he came up to the major leagues, which is above average stuff. It's good. 120.4 so far this season. So if you had that number just on its own, you'd be looking at it saying, okay, are those strikeouts, is he going to increase his strikeout percentage? But we've already seen that jump, and it just kind of reinforces and solidifies that there's a good chance that jump in strikeout percentage for Logan Gilbert is real. So certainly like him. Again, it's hard to say you like him more than Pablo Lopez since he is more expensive. On FanDuel, I hadn't actually looked at the pricing, but that is an interesting thing to take a look at. So I'm going to pull that up quickly. On FanDuel, you have, it would help if I had sorted before the show. But on FanDuel, you have Lopez at 9,200. You have Gilbert at 10,900. So you get actually a really interesting tournament strategy pivot point, whatever you want to call it, on FanDuel, because you can only roster the one pitcher. Like on DraftKings, you're going to have both of those pitchers in a high percentage of lineups. Somebody asked in chat if you can play them both together. Yeah, absolutely. On FanDuel, obviously you can't. So this becomes really interesting where Pablo Lopez is the better projected pitcher. He's the pitcher that I would recommend if ownership doesn't matter and you're just taking one guy. But you can just play Logan Gilbert for $1,700 more if you can find that salary, and you're getting him at like 1/3 the ownership. Not quite, but between 1/2 and 1/3 the ownership. So that by itself is a really interesting strategy I think you can take on FanDuel that isn't available on DraftKings, where you're getting still a really, really good pitcher, and he's just naturally going to be relatively low owned because you can only roster one pitcher, and Pablo Lopez is going to pull so much of that ownership. On DraftKings, you're just going to play them together a lot. I mentioned it, I think it was about 41% projected ownership coming in to Gilbert on DraftKings. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a completely different strategy than on FanDuel, which is perfectly fine. So both of these pitchers look good. I have Lopez going a little bit more over-owned than Gilbert, but they're very similar in that they're clearly two of the top pitchers in terms of chances of success, in terms of being optimal, and it's just a matter of what you can build around them. Now, from a hitting standpoint, it becomes really interesting because it's a 3-game slate. If this were a normal size slate, it would be really, really easy to just move on from both of these offenses, given the matchups that they have, given the implied run total in this game, and the fact that it's not a great park for hitting. But with it being a 3-game slate, you need to find ways to leverage the field and try and negatively correlate with the field. So I think there are a couple different approaches that you can take here. Now, on top of this game being unappealing from a hitting standpoint because both pitchers are so good, the other problem you're going to run into is that the other 2 games on the slate are in Great American Ballpark and Coors Field. So not only do you have really bad matchups for the Mariners and the Twins, you also are the other 2 games are in the 2 of the best parks you can hit in all of baseball. So you could full stack against either of these pitchers solely for the reason of it's baseball, random stuff happens. The Mariners and Twins both have power in their lineups. And if they come through, then a large percentage of the field is missing out is losing because their pitcher didn't do well. That's one approach you can take. The problem with that approach is that it's contrarian for sure, and it negatively correlates with the field, but there's still going to be a relatively high percentage of people that do that, in the sense that people are just going to be aware that you can stack against popular pitchers. And so if the pitcher gets completely blown up, you're still competing with a relatively high raw number of lineups that just have 4 and 5 man stacks against that pitcher. A different approach I think you can take that's really interesting and I think works on a 3-game slate is just grabbing 1 or 2 of these hitters against that pitcher, because there's still a really high chance. If Pablo Lopez gives up, let's say Pablo Lopez gives up a home run to Cal Raleigh and he gives up a home run to Julio Rodriguez, there's still a good chance that he's one of the best pitchers on the slate, because he can very easily strike out 7 guys, give up 2 or 3 solo home runs, and outscore Cal Quantrill and Keaton Winn and these other pitchers on the slate. So I think I actually prefer, and again, I haven't built lineups for the slate, so maybe this isn't how it works out, but just from in my head, a strategy standpoint, I actually prefer the approach of grabbing 1 or 2 power bats against Lopez, hope you get the right one, they hit a home run. And I think that might actually end up being a little bit lower utilized strategy than even full stacking against him. And it's obviously more likely to succeed, because when you full stack against him, you need that good pitcher in a good spot to just blow up. And you need your Mariners 5-man to beat the Coors Field stacks, to beat the Cincinnati stacks. Whereas here, you can use those guys as a 1-off or 2-man or whatever you want to do. And it's more likely that one of these pitchers just gives up a couple home runs and is otherwise good, as opposed to that they get blown up. So I do like that strategy. On the other side, you have Ryan Jeffers as a catcher, which works. So any bats you're getting to, it's purely from a negative correlation with the field, 3-game slate, game theory type angle. I don't think, if you're playing cash games or something, I don't think you're getting to any of these guys outside of maybe Cal Raleigh. Looks like Rivas and Rojas are pulling some ownership because they're so cheap as well. But that's pretty much the hitting angle for me there. I think that it's a really interesting game. Clearly, the pitchers are going to lead the way. Next, we have the Diamondbacks taking on the Cincinnati Reds in Cincinnati. As I mentioned, one of the best parks for hitting. You do have another ace on the mound with Hunter Green going at 8,600. Slade Ciccone is not an ace. He's not bad, especially in terms of limiting production so far in his limited time in the majors, but certainly on a different level in terms of talent than Pablo Lopez, Logan Gilbert, Hunter Green are. Green for the season striking out 27.8% of hitters, 4.09 xFIP, does typically give up some power. So far this year, he hasn't given up too many home runs. he's only allowed 0.45 home runs per 9. That number probably changes just based on what we've seen from him in the past, but his expected ISO this year to both sides of the plate is really low. I do think that's worth noting. Sub 100 expected ISO to both lefties and righties. If you go back and look at last season, it was 182 to righties, 142 to lefties. He got really unlucky in terms of actual ISO allowed compared to expected ISO in general last year. So you expected him to probably regress some, but it looks like he maybe has made some actual improvements in terms of quality of contact as well. This is still a really good park for offense, for home runs, for all of that. So Green is pulling 45% ownership, very similar to Logan Gilbert. I think that is warranted. 39% of the lineups that I built have Green. So I view him very similarly to Gilbert when you factor in the salary and the fact that Green is $1,400 less, I think it was, on DraftKings. If they were the same price, I would prefer Gilbert. But factoring the salary, I think they're very similar. Ciccone on the other side, pulling 17% ownership, showed up 20% for me. He is a 3-game slate play. You're not looking at the pitchers on this slate and saying that you really want to get to this guy, but he is only 7,100. He's not super popular. He's just going to fit into some lineups if you're playing a lot of lineups. Since coming up last season, 24% K percentage to righties, only 16% to lefties. Expected ISO to both sides of the plate, just north of 200. So again, he does give up some power. His expected WOBA allowed is good, but he does give up power. I know I misspoke earlier. 313 expected WOBA to lefties, 292 to righties. So overall, he does do a good job of limiting expected production. But when he makes mistakes, he doesn't have good enough stuff to not get hit hard. And you see that in the expected ISO numbers. So offensively, both of these teams are going to look pretty solid. Obviously, it's a better matchup for Cincinnati, but they're actually coming in pretty similarly as far as 5-man stacks go. Overall stacks, you get Cincinnati moving up ahead of Arizona, but still pretty similar. And there's just a lot of offensive upside in this game. Elly De La Cruz is showing up as the top hitting play for me. I don't think that should surprise anybody. He's got the pretty, decent, solid matchup against Ciccone, and he's been fantastic this year. I've said it, I joke around about him on Twitter a lot because he had that really good stretch when he came up last year and everybody thought he was like the best player ever. And then he ended up having a below average offensive season. He's doing this season what people thought he did last year. And it's kind of not getting talked about or going overlooked because the Reds play so many of their games outside of main slates that nobody's paying attention from a DFS standpoint, but he is an absolute monster. Tons of power, tons of speed, solid matchup here. Looks really good. Projected for 32% ownership, showed up in 26% of the lineups I built. Then you get to a couple Arizona bats with Corbin Carroll back at the top of the lineup, Christian Walker batting cleanup. They both look good or good enough. It's not a good matchup, but it is a great park and it's a 3-game slate. Then things drop off a little bit. You get Luke Malley showing up basically as a value play. He's not a good hitter. He's just really cheap at opening up other stuff for you. You get some other value with Candelario. Jock Peterson hitting third looks good. TJ Friedel's at the top of the lineup for the Reds. I like that quite a bit from a value standpoint as well. He's cheap at 4,400 and in a pretty good spot. So you can really just get to the offenses in this game pretty much however you want to. But, De La Cruz really stands out to me as the top guy. Carroll, Walker, Friedel, I think, kind of look like the guys that I would want to get to the most behind De La Cruz. And then finally wrapping this slate up with Coors Field, San Francisco taking on Colorado. We have Keaton Winn on the mound for the Giants. We have Cal Quantrill going for the Rockies. 19% ownership coming into Winn. So he is getting similar ownership to Ciccone. He's getting similar ownership to Ciccone. Similar ownership to Gilbert on FanDuel, but that's not relevant. He's getting similar ownership to Ciccone. I actually have him going quite a bit under-owned here, and it's not a great feeling. It's Coors Field. It's not a great strikeout match, or it's not a great strikeout pitcher. It is a good strikeout matchup. The Rockies suck. But for the season, a 20.3% strikeout percentage for Winn, 3.69 xFIP. He is a solid pitcher overall. The Rockies cannot hit. And this is just one way I think you can be a little bit different in tournaments. Obviously, I would really like to be prioritizing getting to Hunter Green, Logan Gilbert, and Pablo Lopez just based on talent. But you can go to Winn at modest ownership, open some stuff up, get to more of the Elly De La Cruz plus expensive Diamondbacks type stuff if you wanted to. So I think Wynn's going a little underowned. And then the same goes for Cal Quantrill, which I have even less optimism or confidence in him than I do Wynn. He's got the more difficult matchup going against the Giants. He's not a very good pitcher at all, but it's a 3-game slate. He's getting 8% ownership. He's $5,200, 15.5% K percentage, 4.65 xFIP this season. There's nothing here. Cal Quantrill is kind of the pitching equivalent of going to Seattle bats or Twins bats, except for Seattle bats and Twins bats actually can hit. Quantrill can't even really pitch. But it's the same kind of thing where if he happens to somehow have a good game, you're going to not only have a low-owned pitcher that's cheap and having a good game, but you're also going to negatively correlate with the field because you're likely to get a bunch of ownership coming into the Giants. 36% coming into Estrada, 21 to Nick Ahmed, 29 to Wade, 23 to Chapman. If somehow Cal Quantrill just goes out there and limits these guys, then you are getting a little bit of a leg up on the field because a third of the field is losing out on Giants points. So basically the game theory equivalent where if this slate were bigger, you wouldn't have any interest at all. He's still the lowest probability play for me as far as pitching goes, but is going underowned as far as optimal percentage versus ownership. Offensively, it's Coors Field. So the Giants are showing up as the top 5-man stack. They're showing up as the top overall stack. Neither of those things should be too surprising. They obviously haven't been great this year, but they do have enough talent on their team. Since the start of last season, 186 expected ISO to lefties for Quantrill, 179 to righties. Does give up some power. 346 xWOBA to righties, 359 to lefties. Gives up production as well. He's, I think, pretty clearly the weakest pitcher on the slate. He's in Coors Field, so clearly the Giants are going to look really good. And then Colorado, middle of the pack because they aren't facing Pablo Lopez or Logan Gilbert, basically. They're still in a good park. They're probably not going to get as much ownership as the Giants. They're not showing up nearly as much. It is interesting, though, at least right now, from an ownership standpoint, Tovar is getting a lot of ownership, but then it really drops off. Montero at 12%, Doyle, Diaz, Rogers, all 10 to 15%. A very expensive Ryan McMahon, projected for just shy of 10% ownership, is, I think, a way you can be different in tournaments that's interesting. So the Rockies, from a contrarian standpoint, I think actually look pretty good. But again, they are the Rockies. They are not good. They cannot hit. But it's a 3-game slate. You're getting a team in Coors Field that is moderately owned. I actually want to just take a look at the projected ownership for the Rockies hitters compared to the Seattle-Minnesota game. And yeah, it's pretty interesting to me. Like, I understand why. Cal Raleigh is good. I think he's a good play and all of that. But like, Cal Raleigh is getting more ownership than any player on the Rockies outside of Tovar. Rogers is similar to Rojas in terms of ownership. Garver is similar to Blackman. Like, the Rockies are getting similar ownership to the team facing Pablo Lopez in Minnesota. So you're not getting the same level of negative correlation with the field as you are if you take those Mariners bats against Lopez. But just from a raw ownership standpoint, that is pretty interesting to me that Colorado is going to have similar ownership to the Mariners. And that does kind of go back to what I was saying as far as I think there's a decent chance that full stacks aren't really underowned when you talk about the Mariners, because I do think that you're just going to have people get to them. But I think that if you just grab one or two of them, that might be a way to actually be a little bit more contrarian in terms of roster construction. I could be wrong there, but I think that's likely to be the case. So pretty interesting early slate. From a pitching standpoint, you have Green, Gilbert, and Lopez standing out as clear top options. From a contrarian pitching standpoint, going to Coors Field seems like the way to be contrarian, which doesn't seem fun, but it is what it is. Offensively, you have San Francisco as the top stack, Arizona, Cincinnati coming in as 2 and 3. From a contrarian standpoint, the Rockies look like the most interesting full stack to me, just from like a low ownership standpoint. From a optimal percentage versus ownership percentage, it looks pretty mixed up here. Like, you're seeing some of the value guys at the top with Ahmed and Luke Maile. Kind of want to ignore those as far as contrarian plays, but you have like Ketel Marte and Gurriel mixed in from Arizona is going underowned. You have Rodriguez and Haniger mixed in from Seattle. So again, sort of, I think, reiterating my initial assumption that getting to maybe like one off, two off, mini stacks against these popular pitchers might be a good way to go as opposed to full stacking. Larry said, any stack preference on short slates? Not really. I don't change anything. I don't change anything in the way that I build lineups. You can see here, I think this is another cool thing about sim tools that people don't really talk about. Assuming that the sim tool you're using has correlation built in, it kind of answers the question for you of, how you should be adjusting, what you should be doing. You're still getting a lot of 5-2, 5-3 man stacks here at the top, followed by 4-3, 4-4, 5-man. So I'm not changing a lot. I'm more likely to end up with some smaller stacks just because there's less options to have 5-man stacks of, but I'm still, stacking pretty heavily. I'm not actually sure how to do this. So this might not work. I wanted to see how my lineups are looking. What percentage of my Pablo Lopez lineups have Seattle bats? And it's actually not as high as I expected it to be. Julio Rodriguez is actually showing up the most in 13% of the Pablo Lopez lineups that I built. Cal Raleigh coming in second, 13%. So they are showing up. But again, this is something else that I think is just cool that you can do if you're using any sort of Sims tool that does factor in correlation, is you can kind of answer that question of, should I play a hitter against my pitcher, or should I play 2 hitters against my pitcher? Whatever it may be, because it's doing the math, it's doing the work for you instead of you having to actually talk through it and think through it. So I think that's something interesting that you can do if you're using a quality sim tool as well. Now we can switch over to the main slate. Before we do that, quick pitch for my MLB content that is behind the paywall at Dub Club. If you're interested in that, you can sign up using the link in the description below. You get 20% off your first month with any of those links. We have MLB DFS content, have betting content, which is primarily my strikeout prop bets. I have a strikeout sim that I built for myself that you have access to there. MLB DFS content-wise, you get my notes game by game for all of the main slates during the week, and then you also get access to me in Discord, normally in there on the weekend as well, talking strategy, talking slates, all of that. And you also, for most of the slates I'm playing, definitely all the ones during the week. And then again, typically on the weekend, you get access to my data around a half hour before lock, showing you top stacks, stack ownership, DK hitter project, or DraftKings and FanDuel rather, hitter projections, ownership projections, optimal percentage, hitters broken down by position, hitters broken down by most underowned, most overowned, top overall in terms of optimal percentage, all the same stuff for pitching. So that's $25 a month regularly. Use the link below. You get 20% off. Now back to today's games. Starting at 7:40 tonight, we have another 3 games, and it's not in Coors and it's not in Cincy, since those are on the early slate. So not the same level of offensive hitting environments, but that also makes the slate kind of interesting too. I like that we have the two really good offensive parks on the same slate instead of it just being like Coors Field on one slate and Cincy on the other. So we have, starting this slate off with St. Louis taking on the Brewers. Sonny Gray is on the mound for the Cardinals after getting rained out the other day. Tobias Myers is going for the Brewers. Myers, so far this season in a limited sample, striking out 20% of hitters. Sonny Gray striking out 33.3%, only walking 4%, 2.3 xFIP. He's been fantastic. He is really expensive, and the matchup is not ideal. The Brewers do have good hitters. The park is good for hitting, but Sonny Gray has been really good. He's projected for 58% ownership. He showed up in 45% of the lineups that I built. So similar to how Pablo Lopez looked on that early slate, Gray is clearly a top pitching option. I think he's going a little bit under-owned. Maybe that pushes me towards some Brewers in tournaments, but clearly one of the highest likelihood plays, even at that salary. Because that's the thing to keep in mind as well. When you look at the percentage of lineups that he's in, it's not just telling you he's 45% to be a top 2 scoring pitcher. It's telling you he's 45% to be in the winning lineup. And, based on what was simulated for these lineups. So it is factoring in his salary as well. And even at that elevated price tag, he's very likely to give you a winning score. Tobias Myers, only projected for 8% ownership, showed up about 15% of the time for me. So he's kind of your Cal Quantrill, where, not to say that he's, Cal Quantrill in Coors. I think he's probably better than that. But where he's just a pretty low probability play, but not as low as the field seems to be giving him credit for. It's not a great matchup against the Cards in terms of strikeouts, but it is a bit of a watered down lineup. They've been banged up all year. Now they also don't have Wilson Contreras since he fractured his arm the other day. So if you need a low-owned pitcher that's cheap, I think Myers is reasonable, but not any sort of a priority. Offensively, 5-man stacks for the Cards are showing up the second most often. Milwaukee showing up the second fewest. All forms of stacks. St. Louis still showing up second most often. Milwaukee actually showing up the least. As far as individual hitters go, not surprisingly, it's mostly St. Louis at the top. Nootbaar, Goldschmidt, Donovan, Arenado. Now you could start to make the case for Goldschmidt that he may just be being overprojected. Maybe he really is washed. Maybe he's fallen off based on just the lack of quality contact this year. But I still, especially with hitters, tend to just still rely pretty heavily on projections and what they've done in the past and how they project going forward, because it's a lot more difficult to figure out changes that maybe are going on in hitters than it is in pitchers. Like, you have all this data on pitching. You can see where they're throwing the ball from. You can see so much stuff, how their pitches are moving, what they're throwing, how it's spinning, all this stuff. Hitting, you kind of just have the result of at bats. Now you have better data now as far as quality of contact and if they're hitting the ball on the ground and launch angle and all of that. But you still don't have, is he intentionally doing things different, or is he just in a funk and he's going to break out of it? The assumption is still that eventually these guys with track records like Goldschmidt break out of it. Reasonably priced St. Louis hitters here as well. Nice park. So yeah, they look good. On the Milwaukee side, Contreras, Yelich going to be the guys that you probably get to the most against Sonny Gray. Clearly a really, really bad matchup, but they are good hitters. It's tough to pay these price tags when William Contreras is $5,600 despite the matchup, but they look to be going a little bit under-owned, and they do give you negative correlation with Gray in addition to the low ownership. Willy Adames at shortstop looks like a solid way to be different as well. He's getting a bit more ownership than Contreras and Yelich, though. If Nolan Gorman's in the lineup, he looks like a pretty good value at $3,600. So offensively, St. Louis looks like one of the better teams on the slate. Milwaukee, you do get a high upside offense with a lot of talent that does negatively correlate with a very popular Sonny Gray. Next, we have the Cleveland Guardians taking on the Chicago White Sox in Chicago. Good matchup for Ben Lively. Eric Fetty is on the mound for the White Sox. This is an interesting pitching matchup in that we kind of don't know what either of these guys are. Neither one were in the major leagues for a while. So far this season, Lively has struck out 28.6% of hitters, which is not what he's projected to do. Eric Fetty has struck out 25% of hitters, which is not what he's projected to do. And it can be difficult with pitchers like this because projections are based on, what they did previously in their career. And then I think like Fetty went to maybe the KBO. I could be wrong on that. But you never know really what type of adjustments these guys made because you don't have the same sort of tracking data that you do for guys in the majors and the minors. So I do like also looking at Stuff Plus for these guys. Ben Lively's is terrible this year. It's in line with what he had done in the past. So maybe the strikeout percentage is real. Like he's continuing to do it, but I still have trouble buying into it. I'm still very likely to just rely on projections for him. Eric Fetty, on the other hand, I think there's a real chance that he is just a better pitcher than he'd been in the past. You see the Stuff Plus over here for this season, right around 101, so a little bit above average, whereas in the past, very, very far below average. So I have a little bit easier time buying into Fetty being a decent strikeout pitcher now or a good strikeout pitcher now than Lively. But again, with every start that these guys make, you should be relying more on like the percentage of strikeouts that they've actually gotten so far. It is a good spot for Lively. So from a DFS standpoint, not getting into the pitching anymore, just from a DFS standpoint, he looks good. 7,600 facing the White Sox, showed up in 41% of the lineups I built, 47% projected ownership. So I'm right around the field there. There's not a lot to say. The White Sox aren't very good. They're probably not as bad as they were to start the season, but they're still not very good. Overall this year against right-handed pitching, they have an 81 WRC plus. They have only struck out 20.7% of the time, but it's clearly a good matchup for Lively. On the other side, I do think Fetty's a really interesting tournament pitcher. It's a bad strikeout matchup against the Guardians. He is relatively expensive at 8,500, but he's only projected for 13% ownership, and he showed up nearly twice or more than twice that often in the lineups that I built. So I am interested in Fetty. Like I said, I do think that there is reason to buy into his solid results so far this season. Not only does he have that 25% strikeout percentage, he also has a 3.76 xFIP, which is really good. Ben Lively's xFIP 3.33, so like he's been really good there as well. But again, I just kind of buy into Fetty stuff a little bit more. I like the lack of ownership there. From an offensive standpoint, Cleveland showing up third most in terms of 5-man stacks. It is a nice park for them to hit in. There is certainly some chance that Fetty drops off, but I don't think the matchup is great. But they do have one of the higher implied run totals on the slate. There's not great hitting spots on the slate in general. The White Sox are showing up the least as far as 5-man stacks go. They show up a little bit more with mini stacks. It's an approach I took with them yesterday against Aaron Savali. I think it's a solid approach again today to just mix in a couple of them, get some negative leverage against Lively in your non-Lively lineups, or even if you have Lively, again, you can mix those guys in. Jose Ramirez shows up as the top play here. That's not surprising at 6K. Jimenez, Naylor, they're all expensive, which is a problem, especially if you do think that Fetty is better than he has been in the past. But it is still a solid park to hit in. You might have Florial leading off at a really cheap price tag. For Chicago, I think you're looking to Tommy Pham, Jimenez, Sheets, Lopez, the top of the order. They're just cheap. They're not bad. They're not good, but they're not bad. They do have some power at the top of the order. Sheets gives you multi-position eligibility as well. I see Terry in chat. Good to see you. Thanks for checking out the show. So, yeah, I think the White Sox are interesting just from a Ben Lively. We don't know what the hell he is, and he's going to be almost 50% owned standpoint. The Guardians just have one of the higher implied run totals on the slate. I do buy into Fetty being an improved pitcher, though, so I think that's something to keep in mind. And then finally, wrapping things up with the Kansas City Royals taking on the LA Angels in LA. Reed Detmers is going for the Angels. Michael Wacha is on the mound for Kansas City. $7,100 price tag on DraftKings for Wacha. Detmers, $8,700. Detmers, I think the ownership is like exactly on point. 33.1% projected ownership, 33.1% of the lineups that I built. Pretty close for Wacha too, 42% ownership, 37% of the lineups that I built have Wacha. I did ladder Detmer's strikeout overs up to 9 today on FanDuel. So if you are looking to make bets, I did that. Not financial advice, but you can win or lose with me if you want to do that. Detmers is a good strikeout pitcher. The matchup isn't great, but for the season, 26.7% K percentage, about a 3.6 xFIP, just a good pitcher overall. It is a good park for hitting, but when Detmers is on, he's able to bury that slider back foot to righties and really rack up strikeouts. Michael Wacha, not as good a strikeout pitcher, but he does have a solid matchup. He is cheap for the season, a 19% K percentage, but a respectable 4.1 xFIP. No Mike Trout for the Angels really weakens this lineup. Their active roster this year against right-handed pitching has a 22.5% K percentage, 91 WRC plus. So solid matchup, solid price tag. I think that he's going, like, compared to Tobias Myers, he's going over-owned as far as chances of being optimal versus the gap in ownership. But he is clearly much more likely than Tobias Myers in this price range to be optimal. So happy to get to Wacha. He looks good. If you're looking to stack against popular pitchers, I think this is a more appealing game to do it than like Milwaukee against Gray, or really even probably like the White Sox against Cleveland, because you are still getting ownership coming into Detmers and Wacha, but you're getting a really good park for hitting. Kansas City is a team that I always like to stack. They're actually showing up the most for me right now, which does kind of surprise me, but because Detmers is good, but Detmers will give up some power. This is, again, a good hitter's park. So I understand it, and there is plenty of upside also at relatively weak positions for KC. So they look interesting. The Angels also against Wacha, not a very good offense, but reasonably priced, and Wacha is not a great pitcher. Individually, Bobby Witt Jr. showing up the most. Really like that. No problems there. A little surprised that Garcia is showing up the second most of anybody in this game, but it's a lot of guys pretty close together. He's showing up the third most. Adam Frazier as a value play is kind of a placeholder. He's showing up a lot as well. Velasquez is cheap. I like Vinny Pasquantino. Don't sleep on him, despite the lefty-lefty matchup against Detmers. Detmers actually is not dominant against lefties. Since the start of last year, he has a higher xWOBA allowed, a higher X ISO allowed, and his strikeout percentage is about 7 points lower against left-handed hitters. And the reason has a lot to do with what I alluded to before, his ability to just bury that back foot slider to righties where it looks like a fastball and then it just dives at their feet and they swing over the top of it. It drives up his strikeout percentage against righties. It's not the same pitch against lefties. So it's not really surprising to see him have reverse splits. That's not to say that it's a great matchup for Pasquantino or anything, but if you're going to KC, don't sleep on him. He looks like he's going a little bit under-owned for me. Renfroe, if he's in the lineup, looks good. Perez at catcher always looks good. I like Mickey Moniak as a value play. Only 2,900, likely hitting toward the top of the order for the Angels. Has some power upside against Waka. So I think that he is interesting as far as, a one-off or as part of stacks. Waka, since the start of last season, has allowed more power to righties than lefties. His reverse splits are also explainable. He has a good changeup that he throws a lot to lefties. It's not something he throws a lot or is particularly effective to righties. He has thrown it 30% of the time to righties so far this year, 29% last year. So he throws it. It's just not as good a pitch. To same-handed hitters. So that's why you see that. Logan O'Hoppe, a catcher, is going to look pretty good. If you can afford Taylor Ward, great. Joe Adell's pretty cheap and has power. So I like the offenses in this game. I also like the pitching in this game. I think that there's nothing wrong on the 3-gamer of kind of just having one or two hitters against your pitcher in this game too, if you're going that route. I think it's a little bit less ideal on this slate than on the early slate, just because pitching is more equal on this slate. All of these guys just look pretty good for the most part. Whereas on the early slate, Lopez and Gilbert look so much better. Hunter Green is in there too, but like those guys look so much better than the rest of the pitching that I think having a hitter against your pitcher on the early slate looks a little bit better. Whereas on this slate, if I want to play Kansas City and Angels hitters, I can just take pitching from the other games because they look similar. And then where I'm not playing Kansas City and Angels pitchers, I can take pitching from this game and play other offenses. So I think that strategy works a little bit better on the early slate. As far as the top plays on this slate, from a pitching standpoint, again, a lot of pretty similar pitching, but Sonny Gray looks the best to me, followed by Lively, Waka, Detmers. Offensively, the Royals, the Cardinals, Guardians look like the stacks I would get to the most. The most under-owned pitcher, I think, is Eric Fetty. He's been good this year. It's not a good strikeout matchup, but looks like he's going a little under-owned, or actually a lot under-owned. Offensively, from a contrarian standpoint, we have the Cardinals showing up a good amount. Herrera, Wynn, Arenado, Gorman. So they look like a good contrarian stack. And it looks like the Brewers going a little bit under-owned as well. Obviously, a really, really bad matchup against Sonny Gray, but it is a good park. It is a 3-game slate. They do have talent in their lineup, so I get it. Wouldn't be surprised if I end up getting to some of them. So that's all I have for you on this one. Thank you for checking out the video. Give it a thumbs up if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. I really appreciate it. Other than that, if you're in my Discord, you can talk to me in there. I'll be around up till lock. I'll be posting my data as well. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow at the normal time at noon to talk Friday slate. Thanks again for checking it out. Good luck on today's slates.